It was a rainy afternoon when my husband Harry hurriedly left for an important meeting at work because of a last-minute crisis. I barely had time to kiss him goodbye before the sound of his car faded into the distance. I stood by the window and watched the rain fall, feeling uneasy for some reason I couldn't quite put my finger on. About 30 minutes later, the doorbell rang, and when I opened it, there was Tom, my husband's best friend. He looked drenched with his dark hair stuck to his fore. Since college, Tom and Harry had been best friends, almost like brothers. He had always been around like family, but I hadn't paid much attention to him outside of their friendship. "Sorry to drop by without warning," Tom said, rubbing the back of his neck. "My car broke down in the neighborhood. I tried calling Harry, but it went straight to voicemail. Do you mind if I come in for a bit?" I hesitated for a moment, feeling a strange sense of unease creep in. But what harm could there be? It was Tom, after all. I stepped aside and let him in. "Of course you can stay until the rain stops," I replied, offering him a towel. "You look like you've been through a storm." Tom laughed in a deep, familiar way. While he dried off, I made us both a cup of tea and sat down at the kitchen table. The sound of rain hitting the windows gave us a strange feeling of closeness. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but Tom seemed more present today. He wasn't as playful as usual, and there was a serious look in his eyes as he watched me. He looked around the room and then back at me and said, "You have a nice place. Harry is lucky." That was a nice smile. "I don't think I've ever told you that. We worked hard for it. And he's also lucky because you've been such a good friend to him." The silence between us grew heavy and uncomfortable. I stirred my tea, not sure what to say. It kept raining outside, but the house was so warm that it was almost suffocating. Finally, Tom leaned back in his chair and asked, "I've always wondered something." I raised an eyebrow while waiting for him to continue. What would things have been like if Harry hadn't come into the picture first? The question caught me off guard, and I laughed nervously, even though nothing about the situation felt funny. "What do you mean?" Tom smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. All of a sudden, there was an unspoken tension in the air between us, and I didn't know how to react. This was Tom, best friend of Harry. I had known him for years, but something in the room had changed that made me feel like. Before I could say anything, Tom got up and walked over to the window to look out at the rain. His voice was low when he spoke again. "I've always admired you more than you know." I sat there with my cup of tea in my hand, shaking a little. Tom's words hung in the air like a secret that wasn't said, a confession that was made in plain sight. It wasn't like Tom to be this way. He was always funny and never serious, especially not like this. I wasn't sure if I had heard him correctly, or if the loud rain hitting the windows had clouded my judgment. Tom, I didn't know what to say when he turned from the window and stared at me with unreadable emotion. He wasn't the jokester or laid-back best friend I had always known. Instead, he stood there with eyes fixed on me with an intensity I hadn't noticed before. "I'm not trying to make things awkward," he said as he walked back to the table and pulled out the chair next to me. "But I think we both know things have been a little different between us lately." I shook my head and asked, "What do you mean?" I could feel the warmth of his skin on the table as his hand moved towards mine, stopping just short of touching it. The slight brush of his fingers made a knot form in my stomach. The casual friendliness Sharon I used to have seemed to have vanished, replaced by something I didn't know how to handle. It's like there's something unspoken between us every time I've been around you lately. Tom's voice stayed low and cool. I pulled my hand away and stood up from the table to put some space between us. "This is how I've been feeling for a while, but didn't want to say it. This wasn't taking place. It couldn't be." There was no way Tom could have meant what I thought he did. "He was like family to me. My husband is best friends with yours." I tried to sound strong, but my voice was shaking a little. This can't," I said, but he cut me off in the middle of my sentence. "I know. And I would never do anything to hurt Harry. I just need you to know how I feel. I can't keep acting like I don't care about you or that I don't notice the way you look at me sometimes." I froze, replaying his words in my head. Did the way I looked at him give him the impression that there was more between us? I tried to think of times when things might have been misunderstood, but nothing stood out. As far as I knew, everything between us had been normal until now. "You're right," I told him in a quiet voice. "I don't look at you that way." He smiled, but it wasn't a triumphant smile. Maybe he wasn't trying to, but the way we talk and the fact that we spend more time together when Harry's busy make it clear. I felt guilty had I been careless and too comfortable around him. I thought everything I had done was out of friendship and trust. Tom seemed to think there was more, and I wasn't sure how to fix the damage those beliefs had done. The rain outside got worse, echoing the storm inside the house. I couldn't help but feel trapped between my husband's loyalty and this sudden, unexpected confession from the person closest to him. "I love Harry," I whispered more to myself than to Tom, as if to remind myself of what was real. "I'm not asking you to stop loving him, I don't know what I'm asking, I just needed to get this off my chest," Tom said, stepping closer. The honesty in his voice surprised me for a second. I almost felt sorry for him because he seemed to be going through a lot of confusion. "I think you should go," I told him firmly. He didn't move at first. Instead, he stood there and looked at my face. "We can't let this happen." I stood there with my arms crossed, trying to keep some control over a situation that felt like it was quickly slipping away. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Tom said, "You're right. I'm sorry I made things weird." He then grabbed his coat from the chair and walked towards the door. Before he stepped outside, he looked back at me one last time and said, "For what it's worth, I'm not trying to ruin anything between you and Harry. I couldn't keep lying to myself." He then disappeared into the rainy night. The house was quiet again, except for the storm hitting the windows, but my thoughts were louder than ever what had happened. How had everything changed so quickly? Most importantly, how would I tell Harry about this if I even had to? The door clicked shut behind Tom, leaving me alone with the steady sound of rain. His words lingered in the room like a whisper I couldn't shake. I stood there. I slowly walked to the window and stared out at the view while still looking at the empty space he had just left. My heart was pounding in my chest as if it were trying to make sense of the jumbled mess inside me. As it rained, the world outside the window became less clear. The glass felt cool against my fingertips, and I pressed my palm to it to center myself. Tom's confession had shocked me more than I wanted to admit, but not because I liked him, at least not in the way he thought, but because it showed me flaws in my life I hadn't known I had. As I stood there, I thought about the past few months. Harry was always busy with work, meetings, and schedules. There were times when I felt like I was living with a ghost, seeing him for short periods of time while his mind was somewhere else. I told myself it was just a phase because he was busy with work and things would get back to normal soon, but they hadn't. In the space that had opened between us, Tom had slid in like a shadow. And as he became more familiar, we started spending more time together. Spending time together, smiling, talking, and telling stories. Simple things happened that didn't seem important at the time, but as I stood here and went over everything again in my mind, I wondered if those things had been more important than I let myself see. Had I been alone? The question would have been, it hit me like a wave, was this really about Tom? Not his feelings for me, but the growing distance between me and Harry? I hated to say it, but I felt neglected. I missed Harry's presence. I missed the way we used to talk for hours. I missed the small acts of love and affection that used to be the core of our relationship, and Tom had been there, filling a void I hadn't even realized was growing. I sighed and ran my hand through my hair. My mind was going a million different directions. It was clear that I didn't love Shake all that much, but I had let our friendship grow, turn into something more difficult. It was getting out of hand. What would this mean for my marriage? The thought of telling Harry made my stomach hurt. I could picture his reaction, the hurt in his eyes, the betrayal he might feel, not because I had done anything physically wrong, but because I had let something emotional build between me and his best friend without realizing it. But what if I didn't tell him? What if I buried this moment, pretended like Tom's confession had never happened, and moved on with my life? I could put distance between myself and Tom, set limits, and let everything return to normal. But would that be fair to Harry, Tom, or even to myself? The weight of the decision I had to make was amplified by the silence in the house. I could feel how heavy it was in my chest, pulling me deeper into my thoughts. It wasn't just about how Tom felt. It was about the state of my marriage and the cracks that had appeared between Harry and me. The distance between us had grown so slowly that I hadn't even seen it coming. How had we gotten here? I thought about the first time Harry and I met and how excited and thrilled we were to fall in love. We were so young and full of hope and ambition. I remembered the nights we spent talking until sunrise, laughing and sharing dreams, and how we used to look at each other like we were the only two people. I felt tears coming to my eyes, but I blinked them back. I wasn't going to break down over this. I loved Harry, but love wasn't enough. It needed care and attention, the kind of things we hadn't been giving each other lately. I wasn't sure what the next step would be. All I knew was that something had to change. I couldn't keep acting like everything was fine when it wasn't. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway woke me up. I looked out the window and saw Harry's car headlights cutting through the rain. He was home early, much earlier than I had planned. My heart raced again, but this time for a different reason. I had been thinking about everything that had happened, that I hadn't prepared myself for this moment. I wasn't ready to face him yet, but there he was walking towards me with the door keys in his hand. When he walked in, I had to decide whether to tell him the truth or keep it to myself. The door opened and Harry walked in, shaking off the rain on his coat. He looked tired from a long day, but he smiled when he saw me and said, "Hey, you." His voice was warm and familiar. I tried to smile back, but it felt forced and strained. My mind was still reeling from the weight of the truth and the fear of what it might do. "Hey," I said in a soft voice that could barely be heard over the rain. He walked over to me and kissed me on the forehead. "Everything okay?" he asked, his brow furrowing slightly as he noticed the tension in my face. I hesitated, the words sitting on the edge of my tongue heavy and unspoken. This was it. I could either tell him everything or hide it and act like nothing had changed, but something had changed, and I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. "I need to talk to you," I said, my voice shaking. The seriousness in my voice made Harry's eyes widen, and he set down his bag. "What is it?" he asked quietly as he stepped closer. I took a deep breath and everything came crashing down around me. It was about Tom. Harry's expression changed and his eyes sharpened on Tom. I nodded, my heart racing. "He said something today that I didn't expect. He has feelings for me." Harry did not move. I could see the fear on his face as he held his breath, and I couldn't wait to hear what he had to say next. Finally, he let out a low, steady breath. "Did anything happen?" I asked quickly, shaking my head. "Harry, we can't ignore this. Something's been missing between us for a while now, and we need to fix it." He looked at me for a long time and then slowly nodded. "Yes, you're right, we do." That's when we both realized in the quiet of our own home that the talk wasn't just about Tom, but also about us.